If you have blue eyes, sit with this for a second. Somewhere out there, right now, there's a stranger on a different continent speaking a language you have never heard, living a life you cannot imagine. And yet, in a very real, very literal sense, that stranger is your relative, not a distant metaphorical cousin, not a poetic exaggeration, an actual traceable genetic relative. Every single person walking around today with blue eyes shares a bond that goes back through thousands of years, through wars and migrations and empires rising and falling, all the way back to one single human being. One person, one moment, one tiny glitch in a strand of DNA that had never happened before in the entire history of our species. Before that moment, as far as science can tell, blue eyes simply did not exist. Every human being who ever lived looked at the world through brown eyes. And then, quietly, without any fanfare, without anyone noticing, something shifted inside one person's genetic code, and the ripple from that single change is still visible today in hundreds of millions of faces around the planet. This is not folklore. It is not a fun fact picked up from a dinner party or a half-remembered biology class. It is the conclusion of careful, peer-reviewed genetic research, built on DNA samples, statistical analysis, and years of painstaking laboratory work. Scientists did not simply guess that blue eyes traced back to one person. They found the evidence written directly into the genome, sitting in the exact same location, in person after person, on different continents, in populations that had barely had any contact with each other for thousands of years. That kind of consistency does not happen by accident. It happens when everyone carrying that trait inherited it from the very same original source. So how does something like this actually get proven? How do you go from staring at strands of DNA under a microscope to confidently declaring that every blue-eyed person on Earth shares one common ancestor? The story starts not in some futuristic gene editing lab, but with a research team at the University of Copenhagen led by a professor named Hans Eiberg, working in the Department of Cellular and Molecular Medicine. Eiberg had been fascinated by eye color for years, ever since the 1990s, when his early research first pointed toward a gene called OCA2 as a major player in determining whether someone's eyes end up brown, green, or blue. But identifying a gene involved in a trait is very different from explaining exactly how and when that trait first appeared. That took another decade of work. Eiberg and his colleagues gathered DNA samples from people with blue eyes, and crucially, they did not limit themselves to one country or one ethnic group. They collected samples from Denmark. They collected samples from Turkey. They collected samples from Jordan. These are populations separated by thousands of miles, different histories, different languages, different everything. If blue eyes had appeared independently multiple times in different places, as a kind of coincidental mutation that just happened to occur more than once in human history, you would expect the underlying DNA to look at least somewhat different from group to group. Different mutations, even ones that produce a similar visible result, tend to leave different fingerprints in the genome. That is not what they found. Instead, when the team examined the genetic material closely, they discovered something remarkable. Every single blue-eyed person in the study, regardless of where their ancestors came from, carried the exact same cluster of genetic markers in the exact same location. Not a similar mutation, not a comparable variation, the identical genetic signature, letter for letter, in the same tiny stretch of the genome. In science, that kind of uniformity across geographically distant populations is essentially a smoking gun. It tells you that this trait did not spring up over and over again by chance. It tells you that everyone carrying it inherited it from one shared source, and that the mutation then spread outward from that single point of origin, carried along as populations moved, mixed, and multiplied over the centuries. Now, here is where the story gets even more specific. The researchers were not just able to say that a shared ancestor existed somewhere in the murky, undefined past, using techniques involving mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down almost unchanged from mother to child across generations, and comparing patterns of genetic variation, they were able to estimate a window of time in which this mutation most likely first appeared. Their conclusion placed the origin somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. In the grand timeline of human evolution, that is remarkably recent. Modern humans have existed for roughly 200,000 years. Blue eyes, by comparison, are a relatively new arrival, a trait that emerged sometime after the invention of agriculture, potentially even after some of the earliest human settlements had already begun to form. Picture that for a moment. While early farming communities were already planting crops and domesticating animals, while the foundations of civilization were just beginning to be laid, somewhere in that world, a single individual was born carrying a brand new genetic variation that had never existed before. That person almost certainly had brown eyes themselves, inherited from their own parents, but buried inside their DNA was a spontaneous change, a copying error, if you want to think of it that way, that altered the instructions controlling how much pigment their eyes would produce. It is entirely possible, even likely, that this individual had no idea anything unusual had happened at all. There would have been no dramatic announcement, no way for anyone at the time to know that a new human trait had just entered the gene pool. And yet, generation after generation, that tiny change was passed down, quietly working its way through family lines, through communities, and eventually across an entire continent. To understand exactly what changed inside that person's DNA, it helps to understand how eye color works in the first place. Eye color is determined largely by a pigment called melanin, the same pigment responsible for the color of your skin and your hair. The iris, the colored part of your eye surrounding the pupil, contains cells that produce and store melanin. If those cells produce a lot of melanin, the iris appears dark, ranging through shades of deep brown to almost black. If those cells produce very little melanin, the iris takes on a much lighter appearance, and depending on how the remaining light scatters within the eye's structure, it can appear blue, gray, or somewhere in between. Green and hazel eyes generally sit somewhere in the middle, reflecting intermediate amounts of pigment, along with some additional genetic influences. The gene most responsible for regulating this process is called OCA2. It provides the instructions for building a protein that plays a critical role in melanin production, not just in the eyes, but throughout the body. Right next to OCA2, physically located on the same stretch of DNA, sits another gene called HERC2. For a long time, scientists assumed HERC2 was simply a neighboring gene doing its own separate job. What Eiberg's research helped reveal was something far more interesting. Tucked inside HERC2 in a segment known as an intron, which is a portion of a gene that does not directly code for a protein but can still play a regulatory role, there exists a tiny sequence of DNA that acts almost like a switch. This switch does not belong to HERC2 in a functional sense. Instead, it reaches over and controls the activity of its neighbor, OCA2, essentially acting as a dimmer, mostly determining how strongly OCA2 gets expressed. In people with the ancestral version of this switch, the one that has existed for the entire history of our species prior to that key mutation, the switch stays fully active. It keeps OCA2 running at full strength, melanin production in the iris continues at a high level, and the result is brown eyes, the original default eye color for every human being who ever lived before this change occurred. But in the individual carrying the new mutation, a tiny alteration in that regulatory switch weakened its ability to activate OCA2 properly. It did not shut the gene off completely. That distinction matters enormously because a complete shutdown of OCA2 leads to a serious condition called albinism, involving a near total absence of pigment throughout the body, along with significant vision problems. What happened instead was far more subtle. The switch simply became less effective, dialing down rather than eliminating the production of melanin in the iris specifically. Less melanin meant lighter pigmentation. Lighter pigmentation, combined with the way light scatters within the layered structure of the iris, produced the pale blue color we now associate with blue eyes. This is genuinely elegant when you think about it. Nature did not need to invent a brand new gene or build some entirely novel biological pathway in order to create an entirely new human trait. It simply needed to slightly adjust the volume on a switch that was already there, controlling a gene that was already there, and the result was a visible characteristic that had never existed in humanity before. One small, almost accidental edit, and an entirely new physical trait entered the human story. Now, here is a detail that makes this discovery even more compelling. When scientists studied the genetic regions responsible for brown and green eyes, they found a surprising amount of individual variation. Different brown-eyed people, even within the same family or the same population, often carry slightly different versions of the relevant DNA sequences. There are multiple ways, genetically speaking, to end up with brown or green eyes, multiple small variations scattered throughout the controlling regions of the genome that can each contribute to that end result. Blue eyes are different. When researchers looked closely at blue-eyed individuals, and that same kind of variation was almost entirely absent. Blue-eyed people, across wildly different populations, showed remarkable genetic uniformity in this specific region of their DNA. There was essentially one version, one shared sequence, appearing again and again. Think about what that means from a statistical standpoint. If blue eyes had emerged multiple times, independently in different populations around the world, you would expect to see multiple different genetic pathways leading to that same visible outcome. In the same way, multiple different pathways lead to brown eyes. Instead, scientists found what amounts to a single genetic fingerprint, shared almost universally among blue-eyed individuals, regardless of where their ancestors originated. Some studies estimate that well over 90% of blue-eyed people carry this identical shared genetic marker, sometimes referred to as a particular haplotype, a specific combination of genetic variations inherited together as a block. That level of consistency across geographically and culturally distant populations essentially rules out coincidence. It points overwhelmingly toward one shared origin. This raises an obvious and fascinating question. If this mutation first appeared in a single person, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, where exactly did that person live? Researchers have spent years trying to answer that question by turning to something even more direct than modern DNA comparisons, which is ancient DNA extracted from the skeletal remains of people who lived thousands of years ago. By sequencing genetic material recovered from ancient human bones and teeth, scientists have been able to check directly whether specific individuals from the deep past carried the blue eye variant, rather than relying purely on inference from living populations. What they found was striking. The blue eye mutation shows up in ancient remains from a surprisingly wide geographic spread, appearing in samples recovered from locations as distant from each other as northern Italy and the Caucasus region, both dating back roughly 13 to 14,000 years. That geographic distribution suggests the mutation likely originated somewhere in or near the region we now think of as the Near East, before spreading outward with migrating groups of hunter-gatherers as they moved into Western and Central Europe over the following millennia. Perhaps the most famous piece of evidence in this story comes from Spain, where researchers examined the remains of a hunter-gatherer who lived roughly 7,000 years ago. His skeleton, discovered in a cave, yielded enough preserved genetic material for scientists to analyze his likely physical appearance. The results suggested a striking and somewhat unexpected combination. Dark skin, dark hair, and blue eyes, a combination almost never seen in modern Europeans. And where lighter skin and light eyes typically evolve together, this individual offered living, physical proof that the blue eye mutation was already well established in European populations by that point in history, spreading through communities well before the genetic package we associate with modern light-skinned Europeans had fully come together. This tells us something important about how traits spread through a population over time. A single mutation appearing in one person does not automatically become common. Plenty of genetic mutations occur throughout history and simply fade away within a few generations, either through pure chance or because they offer no particular advantage. For a trait to spread from one individual to a meaningful percentage of an entire continent's population within a few thousand years, something has to be actively helping it along. This has led researchers to wonder whether the spread of blue eyes might not have been entirely random. One line of thinking involves natural selection, the same evolutionary force responsible for countless adaptations throughout the history of life on Earth. As early human populations migrated northward into regions of Europe with far less intense sunlight than the areas many of their ancestors had come from, lighter pigmentation throughout the body, including skin, hair, and potentially eyes, may have provided certain physiological advantages, such as allowing more efficient production of vitamin D from limited sunlight exposure. Some researchers have also pointed out that lighter eye color may allow marginally better vision in low light environments, an interesting potential advantage in the shorter, dimmer days found at higher latitudes. However, it is worth being careful here, because the original genetic research from the University of Copenhagen team specifically noted that the mutation itself appears to be selectively neutral, meaning it does not clearly improve or worsen an individual's chances of survival or reproduction on its own. If that is accurate, then the rapid spread of blue eyes across parts of Europe may have had less to do with direct biological advantage and more to do with other forces, such as genetic drift, population bottlenecks, or even sexual selection. The possibility that a novel and visually distinctive trait like blue eyes became more common partly because people found it appealing and preferentially chose partners who carried it. Genetic research on this specific point remains an active and ongoing area of investigation, and scientists continue to explore exactly which combination of forces allowed the trait to spread as widely and as quickly as it did. Now, for a twist in this story that deserves real attention because it completely reframes how we should think about the phrase single common ancestor. It is tempting to imagine this original blue-eyed individual as someone unique, some special outlier standing apart from the rest of humanity. But population geneticists point out something that initially sounds almost paradoxical. If you trace back far enough into human history, every single person alive on Earth today, regardless of their eye color, skin color, or ancestry, shares common ancestors. This is simply the mathematics of genealogy. Every generation you go back, your number of ancestors doubles, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. Go back enough generations, and the number of theoretical ancestor slots vastly exceeds the actual number of people who were alive at that point in history. That mathematical reality forces an enormous amount of overlap. Somewhere in the deep past, there exists a point researchers sometimes refer to as humanity's identical ancestors point, a moment in time after which every single person then alive who has any descendants today is an ancestor of literally everyone alive in the present, every single person on the planet, without exception. Estimates place that convergence point somewhere between roughly 7,000 and 5,000 years before our era, remarkably close to, and possibly even overlapping with, the same window of time in which the blue eye mutation is believed to have first appeared. What that means is fascinating. The original blue-eyed individual was very likely not just an ancestor of every blue-eyed person alive today. Given how closely their estimated lifetime lines up with humanity's broader genealogical convergence point, that same individual was almost certainly also an ancestor of the vast majority, quite possibly every single person, alive on Earth today: brown eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes, blue eyes, all of it. In other words, the blue eye mutation was not passed down through some separate, exclusive family tree, isolated from everyone else. It traveled through the exact same web of ancestry that connects all of humanity together. Blue-eyed people carry visible physical proof of a shared genetic mutation. But in a broader, less visible sense, every human being carries proof of shared ancestry with that very same era of history. This does not diminish how remarkable the discovery is. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. It means that an ordinary trait we casually notice about a person's face, something we might mention in a sentence describing what someone looks like, is actually a visible marker connecting hundreds of millions of people to one specific individual in one specific moment in deep human history. Most genetic traits do not offer that kind of clarity. Most physical characteristics we inherit are the product of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of different genetic variations working together in complicated combinations that are extremely difficult to trace back to any single origin point. Blue eyes are unusual precisely because the genetic signal is so clean, so consistent, and so traceable. That said, modern genetic research has continued to build on this original discovery, and the full picture of what determines eye color has grown considerably more complex since the landmark Copenhagen study was first published. While the HRC2 and OCA2 region remains, by far, the single largest genetic contributor to whether someone ends up with blue or brown eyes, particularly among people of European ancestry, it is not the only factor involved. Large-scale genetic studies involving hundreds of thousands of participants have identified dozens of additional locations scattered throughout the human genome that each contribute, in smaller ways, to the final outcome. Genes with names like TYR, TYRP1, SLC24A4, SLC45A2, ACP, and IRF4 all play supporting roles, influencing everything from the overall amount of pigment produced to more subtle aspects like the texture, structure, and even the physical shape of the iris itself. Some of the most recent large-scale genetic studies have identified around 50 distinct locations across the genome that show measurable associations with eye color, a striking increase from the small handful of genes scientists focused on when Eiberg's team first published their findings. This growing complexity helps explain something many people have likely noticed anecdotally, which is that eye color does not always follow simple, predictable patterns within families. Two brown-eyed parents can, in certain circumstances, have a blue-eyed child, and predicting a child's eye color based purely on the parent's appearance is far less reliable than old classroom explanations involving simple dominant and recessive traits would suggest. Modern forensic and genetic researchers, particularly in fields focused on predicting physical appearance from DNA samples, have had to build increasingly sophisticated models incorporating dozens of these different genetic markers, because relying on the HRC2 switch alone, while it explains a large percentage of cases, is not sufficient to accurately predict eye color 100% of the time. There remain individuals whose eye color does not perfectly match what their HRC2 genetics alone would predict. A reminder that even a discovery as elegant and clean as this one exists within a broader, messier biological system involving multiple interacting genes, some of which scientists are still working to fully understand. None of this complexity takes away from the central, extraordinary finding at the heart of this story. Blue eyes, as a trait, did not always exist. For the vast majority of human history, spanning hundreds of thousands of years across every continent our species inhabited, every single human being who ever lived looked out at the world through brown eyes. Then, within a relatively narrow and specific window of time, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, one person, living somewhere near what is now the Near East or nearby regions, experienced a spontaneous, previously non-existent alteration in a tiny regulatory switch buried inside their DNA. That alteration slightly weakened the activity of a gene responsible for producing melanin in the iris. The result was a subtle but visually striking shift, a lightening of eye color from the deep brown that had defined humanity up to that point, toward the pale, cool blue that had never before existed in a living human being. That single individual almost certainly never knew what had happened inside their own genetic code. There was no mirror sophisticated enough, no science advanced enough, for anyone at that point in history to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. And yet that tiny, invisible, silent mutation did not disappear. It was passed down to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, spreading slowly at first, then more broadly as populations grew, migrated, and mixed across the ancient world. Over thousands of years, carried along ancient trade routes, agricultural expansions, and human migrations across an entire continent, that single genetic change eventually reached a scale almost impossible to imagine from its humble singular beginning. Today, somewhere between 8 and 10% of the entire global population carries blue eyes, with significantly higher concentrations found in Northern and Eastern Europe, particularly around the Baltic region, where, in some populations, the majority of people carry this trait. That geographic clustering is not random either. It lines up closely with the historical migration routes scientists have traced using ancient remains, reinforcing the idea that this single mutation rode along with specific groups of people as they settled into specific corners of the continent, then simply continued multiplying across the generations that followed. It is worth pausing on just how unusual this makes blue eyes among human traits. Height, for instance, is shaped by well over 1,000 different genetic variants working together alongside nutrition, health, and environment, making it essentially impossible to trace back to any single origin point. The same is true for most complex physical characteristics, from bone structure to voice pitch to countless subtle facial features. Blue eyes stand apart precisely because, at their core, they come down to one dominant genetic switch, tied to one dominant historical event. That simplicity is part of why this particular trait has captured so much scientific attention, and part of why it translates so cleanly into a story that can actually be told, traced, and verified, rather than remaining an unsolvable tangle of contributing factors. So, the next time you look into a pair of blue eyes, whether they belong to a family member, a friend, a stranger passing by, or your own reflection staring back at you in the mirror, consider what you're actually looking at. You're not simply looking at a color. You are looking at the living, breathing continuation of a single genetic event that occurred thousands of years ago, carried forward faithfully through hundreds of generations of human beings, none of whom ever set out to preserve it deliberately, and yet all of whom passed it along anyway, woven silently into the code of life itself. Every blue-eyed person you have ever met, every blue-eyed person you will ever meet, and every blue-eyed person who has ever existed throughout recorded history, all trace back through an unbroken chain of inheritance to that same original person, that same fleeting genetic accident, that same quiet moment when something entirely new entered the human story for the very first time. And given how closely that moment lines up with the point in history where all of humanity's family trees begin to converge, it is entirely possible that this discovery does not just connect blue-eyed people to one another. It may well connect nearly all of us, across every eye color, every ethnicity, and every corner of the globe, back to that same distant, unknowing ancestor, a single ordinary person who, without ever realizing it, changed the human face forever.